Okay, and then on domestic, there is a report that Laura Loomer met with the vice president today. Can you speak to her relationship with the administration and if she's informally advising in any way?
She is not. I do know she met with the vice president. As for what was discussed in that meeting, I would defer you to his team.
Thanks, Caroline.
That was Caroline Levitt trying to explain to a reporter what Laura Loomer is doing in the White House. That is a problem that a lot of the president's people have had trouble explaining for well over a year, but we're going to get to that. This is Loomered, and I'm Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil J. Young.
Neil, how are you?
I'm great. How about you?
Well, fine. It's been a minute, and you've been traveling around. You crossed the country, right?
I did.
Learn anything about our great republic coming across the country?
Not a thing, but I will tell you, I watched on my flight yesterday from the East Coast. I watched I'm Still Here, that Brazilian movie that came out last year.
Yes.
Did you watch this?
I haven't seen it. Is it
really
great?
Unbelievable. The actress, whose name, I believe her name is Fernanda Torres. Apologies if that's not right. Was nominated for all the awards. The movie itself was nominated for everything. It's about the military dictatorship in Brazil in 1970. Oh, wow. And it's a true story of a woman whose husband is disappeared, and the decades-long fight to have his death acknowledged. And it is so incredibly moving. And also, it was a movie that came out in 2024, so before the election, and is all the more resonant and terrifying now for the ways state oppression gets directed at political resistors and those on the left, and everyone should go watch it immediately.
Okay, well, I will go watch it immediately. And I want to say, I mean this in the absolute best way, Neil, but you and I are so different. When I'm on a long flight, I always queue up something that Nancy would never watch, like a movie about World War II or, a historical drama from the 19th century. So I admire you making the most of every minute here, and I will definitely go and watch that film. I'd heard about it, but it does in fact seem completely relevant to our strange moment. So let's talk about some of the news that makes our moment so strange. Late last week, peeved by revised job numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, President Donald Trump did what any normal person would do in that circumstance. He fired the messenger, Erica McIntyre, the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Trump's first administration had a record turnover of 92%, and he has a habit of firing people who tell him things he doesn't want to hear. But this particular decapitation in a boring little backwater of the federal government puts a new spotlight on the administration's war on facts. What are the implications of a politicized Bureau of Labor Statistics, Neil?
Well, I think in one way it's just sort of the latest ground upon which this administration is going to attack the facts in a reality-based world. But I think like the effects, the consequences of this are profound for lots of folks. For average citizens who should be able to rely on nonpartisan government agencies to provide basic information, and the ways in which that providing of basic information helps create trust in a country and a citizenry about its government and its leadership. But also, this is like terrible for investors and for job creators and for business persons in this country, and also for those outside the U.S. Who need reliable statistics to determine their investment strategies for the country. And so this is really, really troubling for sort of the existential reasons, and it's also really troubling for the immediate economic consequences of this that I think will be profound in multiple aspects of, American economic life.
Yeah, hard agree, Neil. And, one of my first thoughts, selfish person that I am, is how important the Bureau of Labor Statistics is to historians.
Yeah.
Since we have had the internet, it has been easy when sitting down to write something to go onto the BLS page and look up how much did a secretary make in 1972? How many people filed sexual harassment charges in 1985? And that kind of information adds tangible fact to certain kinds of assertions that we want to pursue in history. It's very worrisome to me to see a range of institutions that you and I have relied on for our entire career becoming unreliable. And obviously that's less important to Wall Street but nevertheless, I think there are a range of ways that people don't quite understand how these boring little agencies prop up the whole country.
That's right.
So, moving on Monday, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren endorsed New York City Democratic primary winner Zoran Mamdani for mayor of New York City. A new poll this week has Mamdani currently polling higher than all of the other candidates combined. August is usually a somewhat fallow month for the mayor's race, so we really can't take anything from this. But Mamdani is collecting endorsements while his chief rival, Andrew Cuomo, is collecting billionaire donors, many of whom are allies of Donald Trump, like Bill Ackman, for example. As this turns into a national race, which is really interesting, I think, to have New York be the kind of theater for the face-off between right and left, let's talk about national money. Politicians like Warren, who has $3.9 million cash on hand, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who has $20.1 million cash on hand, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has $9.8 million on hand, have money that they can legally throw into the race. I'm also thinking about people like J.B. Pritzker, who is bottomlessly wealthy and also the governor of Illinois and has aspirations, we think, to the presidency. I also want to say Bernie has another super PAC called the Friends of Bernie Sanders that has another $20 million hanging out in it. So, Neil, how should we be thinking about the kind of money that Republicans are throwing into this race versus the kind of firepower that Democratic politicians can put behind Mamdani should they choose to do so?
Well, it looks like Democrats don't need to really spend on this race, and that Republicans can maybe burn a lot of cash here with not much results. It's hard to see that Mamdani's win at this point isn't inevitable. I mean, a lot can happen between now and then, but I'm not sure that the infusion of cash really changes things, or if it actually just, helps underscore one of Mamdani's arguments that is part of his appeal in New York City. But I think it'll be interesting to watch to see if Democrats give money here, not from a sort of strategic, or from a standpoint of like strategic for Mamdani's success, or if it's more what they give in order to signal something politically about their own future. So does it count against AOC if she doesn't give some money to Mamdani? Mm-hmm. Does it count against Pritzker if he does? I think like there's ways that there can be real political consequences to these folks, depending on the type of voters they're trying to shore up behind them if they do pursue, some sort of national position like the presidency. But mm-hmm. Does Mamdani need their money at this point? Really? It's not looking like it.
Well, it's hard to say because, of course, primaries can be deceptive. Yeah. And that, a fraction, maybe a fifth of the electorate in New York City voted in the primary, and that was a lot. We are looking at some interesting numbers, like apparently 75% of Jewish voters under the age of 45 are voting for Mamdani. Wow. So it looks like one important block of voters is splintering in ways that it probably has in the past, and there just hasn't been as big a stage for it. I would also say that New York City has always kind of been a big stage for the resistance.
Caesar.
Bless you. It's been a big stage for the resistance to Trump. It's always been a place where anti-war marches were most visible and so on. So I wonder if Mamdani risks losing his own identity and his own candidacy in a much bigger national political struggle. What do you think?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think like one might lose their sort of individuality or their own political brand in a campaign, especially when all eyes are on something that's actually just about the mayorship of one place. But like, if he wins, he has an enormous opportunity to refine and clarify exactly what that political brand is, who he is as a politician, because that'll be an enormous job from day one. But if the question is about him between now and election day, yeah, I think, he could become caught up in things that are much bigger than him and much bigger than the city race itself. But isn't that in some way what any politician wants as well? To believe that they're bigger, that they're important on bigger stages than even the ones they're running for? It seems like a lot of folks would be glad to have that problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the weird things about running for mayor of New York is it tends not to lead to bigger things.
Yeah.
People have a tendency to come from bigger things and then become mayor of New York. But there's something about that job in particular that is an endpoint for many people's careers. And Mamdani is so young that it's hard to believe that that's what he really wants. So we could be looking at a kind of inflection point here for New York, I think, as well. And one other thing before we jump into the next news item is I'm beginning to wonder whether Citizens United has run its course, whether the flood of money in politics really matters in the age of social media in the way that it did when television buys and radio buys and billboards and so on were the main way of communicating with people. What do you think, Neil?
I've been wondering that same thing myself, because then I think, just you're pointing out that like the billionaires have lined up behind Cuomo, and there's some big checks being written, probably more to come. And you can also think about this in terms of the 2024 election and all the money that Kamala Harris had in her war chest. And can we track dollars to votes in the same way that I think we could just a couple of years ago, when it really did have an impact for probably, more than a decade, that I think was traceable and clear. If that's just not what is moving the dial these days, or is it that big spenders need to figure out different ways to move their money that produces the effects that it once did? That it's not that money doesn't count anymore in politics, but it has to be directed a little bit differently than it has for the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that I am seeing certainly on the right and that the left ought to be doing, and it really isn't, is that a lot of the untraceable money that is coming into the Republican Party is going out in similarly untraceable ways, like these networks of online influencers who sort of claim to be consultants and media watchers and so on and so forth. But really what they're doing is pumping out whatever the administration wants to have pumped out at the moment. There are a number of firms that seem to be employing such people to do that. I think the other thing that I think is kind of interesting about the Mamdani race is there's this kind of frantic effort to find out something bad about him.
Yeah.
And last week, the New York Post had a front page where they said Mamdani had admitted to stealing a table when he was at Brown University. And, I could just watch it fall flat on X. No one cares. No one cares about the things that are being said about him. So it'll be interesting to see once we go past Labor Day, whether they've got some bigger guns in the closet or whether this is just a losing effort for the establishment, in which case, what does that mean?
Can I just say something, though, about the stealing the table? Because I think that there's a way that this is not a story about Mamdani. It's a story about our larger moment. I mean, we have a person in the White House who is probably has his name all over the Epstein files, and certainly is photographed time and time again with him, and who a poll just came out a day or so ago. I'm not sure of how solid a poll this is or how sort of reputable it is. But a poll that came out yesterday or the day before showed that 47% of Republicans said they wouldn't care if, in fact, Trump was implicated in the Epstein scandal. So stealing a table when you were in college, what does that even mean to steal a table? But stealing a table when you were in college, more than a decade ago, when this is the sort of stuff we're talking about with the leader of the free world.
Right.
Okay.
Totally agree. I didn't know that 47% of Republican voters said they wouldn't care if Trump is in the Epstein files. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are questioning again how reputable this particular poll was. It didn't come out from like CBS, right? But I think whether or not that number is actually 47%, I think it's more than zero, and that says something given everything we've talked about.
Right. Well, and then along with Citizens United, and then we'll move along, it's hard to know what polls mean anymore.
Right, that too.
When you have over a third and sometimes half of voters in any given state that are not registered with either the Republican or the Democratic Party and who swing wildly from place to place, it's really hard to know what 47% of Republicans means. Sometimes that means about like 20% of the electorate, something like that. All right. So final news item. It's Groundhog Day in the the Texas legislature. This week, most of the Democratic minority in the legislature have run away to blue states to block a vote on a gerrymander delivering 5 more congressional seats to Donald Trump. The last, as they call it, quorum break was in 2021 when Governor Greg Abbott, same governor, called a special session to restrict voting rights. Unlike last time, however, where they all went to Oklahoma on their way to Washington, D.C., and there was a moment when they were all hanging out in a motel in Oklahoma right over the state line, which I thought was very funny. This time they are camping out in blue states where governors like California's Gavin Newsom, Illinois's J.B. Pritzker, and New York's Kathy Hochul are threatening to re-gerrymander their own states if Texas goes ahead with this. What kind of a war is this, Neil?
Well, can I add the latest news to this, which maybe you haven't seen, that I think also speaks to the war? Senator John Cornyn said today that he asked FBI Director Patel to involve the FBI in finding these legislators and bringing them back to the state of Texas. The FBI has not confirmed that they're doing this, but Cornyn has said they are. And so the FBI is being brought into this, and that would be a terrifying politicization of the FBI to hunt down legislators because of politics, over which they have an issue over which they have no sort of jurisdiction here on any level. Part of the charge here is that these folks are potentially have violated federal bribery laws, because I guess the idea is that like fat cat leftists like George Soros are paying them to do this, but like that's obviously a ridiculous allegation that has no truth behind it. But even if that were the case, like the FBI probably shouldn't be involved here at all. So you use the word war, and I think that's really appropriate when we have a federal agency like the FBI being brought into this. And also I think it sort of foreshadows all the ways in which the FBI might be turned into a truly political arm of the Trump administration. But back to the gerrymandering, maybe.
Back to the gerrymander. I just wanted to say it's very hard to feel sorry for Kash Patel. And matter of fact, it's impossible to feel sorry for Kash Patel, but he is so in over his head. He is a lawyer. He knows this is all illegal, and he has zero experience actually enforcing the law. So it's it's hard to know what is going through his head at this moment. And I was also about to say, what judge are they going to get to sign off on those warrants? And then I thought, oh, there's always Matthew Kaczmarek. So, but let's get back to the gerrymander. So Texas just redistricted 5 years ago. And normally this is done after the census, which I think somebody has told Donald Trump, because he announced today as well that he wants a new census. And it's unclear whether he wants a census that is absolutely new or whether he wants the census that was done in 2020 to be changed to remove undocumented immigrants who are in fact counted in the census. Although the way the Trump administration set up the census, it undercounted undocumented people. So the gerrymander that is being asked for here would eliminate not all Democratic seats, but it would eliminate 5 of them, probably. There are, of course, people saying that because people move around so rapidly and because we are between censuses, this actually could be a bad thing because Texas doesn't know who is where. Mm-hmm. And who will be voting in these new districts. They can approximate it, but they don't know. But what is Trump's logic for the gerrymander, Neil?
Well, and this seems relevant to tie to the news item we began with, which was the firing of the labor statistician. This is not a census that is being, he's not asking for a census so that it can be the most accurate reading of numbers. He wants a political. He wants a political document that he can use for his advantage. So I think that's a really interesting idea that like Texas might actually be surprised by the results. But wouldn't the whole point of this would be that there could be no surprise? There could only be political advantage for Trump and his team to exploit and to use to create huge political advantages in the country. I mean, his interest in gerrymandering is to make sure that no matter what happens in the 2026 election, Republicans maintain a majority there. And some of them are saying this out loud. Like, we cannot afford to lose our majority because if we do, then, Trump, everyone's going to go after Trump and he'll lose his mandate and all that. But this is about working the system or creating a system in which his political power isn't weakened by election results a little over a year from now.
Yeah. And of course, Trump is also saying, well, I won Texas in the last election by a huge majority. And the number of Congress people coming out of Texas does not reflect the size of my win there, which is, of course, an apples and oranges kind of situation. And it also elides the fact that exactly Congress was intended to be a check and a balance on the presidency, not a reflection of the presidency. So part of what I find interesting about his statements, which who knows if they were planned by somebody else or anybody even knows what's going to come out of his mouth next, but they reflect the logic of the Trump administration, which is all things should flow from his will and all politics should reflect his will.
Yeah, but that argument also undercuts the Electoral College that brought him to the first presidency. Yeah. Right? Like if the only thing that mattered in politics was like the margin of your victory, we'd have a couple of different presidents having been in the White House. The Electoral College for me, but not for thee, I guess, or some sort of thing here. But that's an interesting argument for him to make about sort of the value of individual votes and the larger, political system we have as tied to the Electoral College.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think the other thing that I'm thinking about is the fact that if California and Illinois and New York and perhaps other states go ahead with what they say they will do, if Texas does this, we have a more structurally polarized nation than we did before. And one of the things that reveals to me is this is, of course, what the GOP has wanted all along. We have people like Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias and David Brooks wringing their hands and saying, oh, polarization is so terrible, and how did this happen, and so on. And it seems to me to sort of pull back the curtain that polarization was the Republican plan all along.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, speaking of polarization, now we get to the red meat of this episode, Neil. Laura Loomer and her impact on the Trump administration. Neil, could you start by telling our listeners who Laura Loomer is and why she's important?
Well, Laura Loomer, she's 32 years old, or somewhere around there. Grew up in Arizona, Jewish, a enormous just an Islamophobe who really made her career, her public profile online and social media spaces, particularly around Islamophobia, but I would also say around sort of the farthest fringes of conspiratorial thinking in the last 5 to 10 years, and also is just a incredible Trump loyalist. And has flirted with politics, has run for Congress from 2 different districts in Florida, and hasn't been successful there, but is someone who, from a lot of reporting, basically has a direct line to Trump. And that direct line also often comes from him reaching out to her, much to the chagrin of folks all around him. And I think that's something that's really interesting here, is that she seems to be one of those figures that even almost every other Trump loyalist and in the administration and the White House is not happy with, is not comfortable with. And yet that doesn't seem to have done anything to change the relationship she has with the president or her influence over him.
Yeah, I mean, Trump gets what he wants. Before we go a little further into her most recent antics and what she represents in this administration, I want to do something no feminist should do, which is I want to talk about what she looks like.
I do too.
Okay, yay.
But glad you started the conversation.
Okay, so a couple things. Massive amounts of plastic surgery. This is common in the circle of women around Trump. It seems to be a prerequisite. Kristi Noem, Pam Bondi have clearly had a ton of plastic surgery. They all seem to go to the same surgeon, or at least surgeons that were trained by the same person, because they all kind of end up looking alike. Unlike some of the other women, Laura Loomer has gone for sort of a goth look. Not blonde, long black hair, sort of very structured eyebrows, bright colors, but she also goes for clothes that are, if not cat suits, they certainly resemble cat suits and make you think Kardashian.
Yeah.
So what are we to make of this look and what it represents on the far right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an interesting distinction here because, like, in a lot of ways, it's a replication of this, like, face and this profile that sort of has moved from Fox News and that sort of conservative media into, I mean, it's there, but it's also in the administration itself. And I think we can think about this just as a phenomenon itself. And, like, why is this a thing? But the differences are almost more compelling than the similarities here that you speak to. And I wonder if it's partly because of, like, her background. She grew up in Arizona, so there feels a little bit of a West Coast influence. I think the Kardashian reference there, Claire, was a really smart one. It's not the sort of East Coast preppiness that I think goes along with a lot of those blonde women you had mentioned. I think it's also that she is self-presenting and self-characterized as a true independent, right? Like, she rails against Republicans. She's run as a Republican, but I don't think she sort of identifies as a Republican so much as she does as, like, her own individual, truth teller. And so maybe that's part of it, of just, like, the complete distinct look here. The other thing that I would say is I think it is relevant to this is she apparently was a very overweight child and weighed like 200 pounds as as a child and was very ostracized. She came from a very tumultuous background. Her parents divorced when she was about 11, and apparently there was a lot of instability there in the home. But I think also the fact that like she was so overweight as a child, she said she had no friends growing up, felt very ostracized, and now she's 125 pounds and apparently is very fastidious about keeping her weight down, and says that every single time she goes to the White House, she buys a new outfit because Trump cares about her appearances, and she knows that. So all of this, it does feel uncomfortable to talk about. I think like we shouldn't really be paying attention to, it feels like we shouldn't be paying attention to people's bodies and their appearances. And yet this feels very relevant for our particular political moment and this particular person that's in the White House.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about in terms of her clothes and pleasing Trump is so important, because there is this sort of wide circle of people who work to grab his attention. She has also distinguished herself from the other Trump women in two ways. One is she wears pants a lot.
Right. Yeah.
We know that Trump does not like women in pants. We know that Trump likes women in short skirts that come above the knees. The other thing I was thinking about, and this came after reading Pamela Paul's piece in the Wall Street Journal about motherhood and Republican women, in which Sarah Huckabee Sanders was featured. The White House spokesperson was featured, and so on. And the article was about how they are working full out for the Trump agenda and are mothers, and they would never put their children in childcare. Many of them have a husband who's taking care of the children or child. There was one who's a Republican congresswoman who never sees her children. And Pamela Paul asked her, she said, does it bother you that you have 3 children under 5 and you're basically missing their childhood? And she said, well, it's just the sacrifice I'm willing to make for the nation. Laura Loomer has no children. Mm-hmm. And to the best of my knowledge, she's not associated with any man but Trump. And that is quite unusual in the Trump circle, is it not?
She does have a boyfriend. But
okay.
Apparently she told him that he had to know that Trump was number one, that he came before everyone. And she has expressed online, on Twitter, that she loves Trump. And I think there's a lot of things happening there, but there is a boyfriend. They share a rented home in Florida, and that's about all the details on him, but that we have. But I think that like there's something about the way she's not replicating many of those characteristics, from being blonde, from wearing skirts, from being married and having children, that like is important to like the place she sits in the Trump universe, as this sort of independent actor that has a direct line to him. And maybe that's the extent of her influence. I mean, her podcast has 80,000 listeners. Now, we would be delighted with that audience, but like, that's not Joe Rogan numbers. That's not anywhere near the sort of like big player numbers. And so I think from all the reporting on her and the way she seems to talk about herself, the sole driver here is about maintaining that one-on-one connection with the president himself. And so I think that makes some of these other things maybe operated a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, I want to drop something in, which I probably should have dropped in at the beginning, which is one of the reasons we're talking about her this week is she just got another person fired, a woman who was supposed to take over a distinguished chair at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, who is a cybersecurity specialist who really is apolitical, has worked in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Biden administration. I think she worked for Trump in the last administration, but Loomer found something in her past that caused her to believe that this woman was disloyal to Trump, tweeted about it, and the appointment was withdrawn by Pete Hegseth. But there's 24 other people that she has gotten fired by tweet. She calls it loomering someone. You have been loomered, which hence the title of this episode. But what's interesting about Laura Loomer is that she herself has relatively few accomplishments of any kind. And if you look around the Trump circle, I mean, someone like Pam Bondi, who is, in my view, despicable, was nevertheless the Attorney General of Florida. That is an accomplishment. That is a resume line. But here's what we have for Laura Loomer. She attended Mount Holyoke for one semester, but then she left, saying that it wasn't a good place for a conservative, which is probably right. She completed a degree in broadcast journalism at Barry University in Florida, which I do not know. Do you know Barry University?
It's in South Florida. It's a private school. It's fine. I believe it's down sort of near Fort Lauderdale.
Okay. So, well, Fort Lauderdale kind of says it all, doesn't it?
Yes.
But here are her accomplishments. She specialized in theatrical confrontations, the kinds of confrontations that have been reframed by the right as journalism. Now, she began this career at Barry University in 2015, where she signed on to do a special project for Project Veritas, in which she would go into an administrator and try to generate enough tape that could be edited to, quote unquote, expose them as supporters of ISIS. She said she wanted to start a student club to support ISIS, which I would actually have to say any administrator who actually thought this was real should be fired immediately.
Right.
So there was that. And then in 2017, Loomer and Jack Posobiec, who's also another right-wing bomb thrower, disrupted a public theater performance of Julius Caesar that depicted Donald Trump as Julius Caesar. Listeners may remember that, saying that the play normalized violence against the right. And it was, in fact, widely criticized for that. But nevertheless, it's a play, guys. And then more seriously, in 2018, she became the architect of conspiracy theories surrounding the Parkland school shootings. And so Loomer, both on her own channels, on Alex Jones's InfoWars, has created videos that assert that this shooting was a false flag operation sponsored by the deep state. And that makes her a kind of nexus for how the far right ecosystem is supporting Donald Trump through the constant generation and recirculation of conspiracy. One of the conspiracies she floated was that the blizzard that occurred on the day of the 2024 Iowa caucuses was caused by the deep state through secret weather technology. Neil, how are we to understand this kind of work as a career path in politics?
One of the things I was wondering is, like, how does she even, like, pay her bills? I mean, I imagine that, like, the podcast audience gives her some sort of ad revenue. Maybe there's consulting fees that the Trump administration is also giving to her. I know that wasn't your question, but it was something I was thinking about as, like, this person who I know so much about, or who seems to be sort of always in the news. But, like, what's the day job here, right? Like, where's the paycheck coming from? And apparently, you know, it's enough to just sort of support a rental house on the coast of Florida. What was the question, though? Like, what does this say about the Republican?
About the role that conspiracies and particularly these celebrities that are the hub for conspiracies. You know, what does this say about how the right is holding itself together, but maybe in tension with the rest of the Republican Party?
Well, it's interesting because, like, we read some really great reported pieces for this conversation, including a really long one in the New York Times that I think folks should read. And this reporter spent a ton of time with Laura Loomer, and including describing a 4-hour drive from DC to New York, where the reporter was saying that Laura Loomer spoke without stopping for 4 hours about the conspiracies of the deep state. So, like, this seems to be, I mean, we're not psychologists here, but, like, this seems to be, like, actually a deeply held belief of this person. But the other thing that struck me in that piece was, like, how much Republicans did not want to be around her. That, like, when the reporter was following Laura Loomer through the halls of Congress, everyone was running in every direction to get away from her. And so you had this sense, and that hasn't always been the case. I mean, like Rick Scott in Florida has like sort of pursued her. Right. JD Vance apparently has as well. So I think there's this like tension between certain Republican leaders who think like, well, I want to be associated with her, or at least want to stay in her good graces. But then like the average Republican congressperson probably just doesn't want to be on her radar at all because they don't want to be Loomered. So what does that mean for her influence, for conspiratorial thinking? I mean, I don't think this means that like conspiracy isn't an operating factor on the right and within Republican circles, whatever the limits of Loomer's particular conspiracism are. But all of this is worth remembering that she has, again, the direct line of the president.
Right.
And so I think that there's something really telling about us maybe recognizing Loomer's influence on conservatism, conservative movement writ large is maybe not that big compared to other folks like Tucker Carlson or whatever, but that she has the president on speed dial. And that they speak regularly.
Yeah, I think they do speak regularly. And I keep sort of, and you know, this happened to me during the campaign too. I keep imagining Susie Wiles and Laura Loomer on the same plane, in the same room, because Susie Wiles is many things, but she's no fool. And she's one of the best political consultants around. And I can't even imagine how, as chief of staff, in the West Wing, she is navigating the porousness of the president to someone who at least one Republican political consultant has described to me as a genuine nut job. And I want to say, just for the lawyers, that Neil and I are making no assertions about the mental health of Laura Loomer, but there are plenty of people out there who do. And that sort of talking nonstop for 4 hours sounds like a piece of it. It also sounds like Trump finds her exciting. I mean, during the 2024 campaign, even as the staff kept trying to like push her to the margins, he kept pulling her back in and getting her on the plane. There was a picture taken of him holding hands with her. And rumors started to fly about what their actual relationship is. We also have some sort of strange bedfellows here. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lindsey Graham have both pushed back on racist comments about Kamala Harris that Loomer has made, in response to which, and I want to pause on this just a bit, Neil, because you're the expert. I remember opening X at one point, and Laura Loomer is tweeting Lindsey Graham about being gay.
Yeah.
You know, and I know that everybody presumes that Lindsey Graham is gay. We also know no one's allowed to talk about it.
Right.
And yet Laura Loomer did, and she got away with it. How did that happen?
Well, when she's doing as much as she's doing, like, is it partly that you can only focus on some of them over the others? I don't know. I think she is so outrageous that in some ways, something like that is maybe covered by the larger, other outrageous things she's done. I don't know, but like, I do think it probably speaks to the particular fear she strikes in Republican politicians, you know, hearts and minds about getting Loomered. And from what we understand, that when, I think this has been fairly well reported, that when others have even sort of suggested they might speak aloud about Lindsey Graham's sexuality, that is shut down behind the scenes with a lot of intimidations and threats. And that doesn't seem to work in this particular example. And I think maybe it doesn't work because it's better to let her do it and hope that it goes away than to do something that she would perceive as an escalation, and that she would just take her tactics up even more so. She clearly, and one of the things that was said about her over and over again is she has no fear. And that's something that the president likes about her. But that also means that there's probably nothing that she will not do. And that probably scares most normal people in Washington.
And you have to wonder if at some point she will go too far and get caught, much as Roy Cohn did, because she is a kind of Roy Cohn figure,
right,
although without the education and the intelligence. and the sophistication. But that getting fingered by Laura Loomer, getting Loomered, seems to be fatal at this juncture in time. And what you're saying, people run away from her. They don't want to get near her. Makes perfect sense. I mean, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, when asked about Loomer's claim that Hegseth had hired her to ferret out leakers in the Department of Defense, he said, well, she's really an outside advocate.
Yeah.
So he didn't say no, but he didn't say yes. But of course, we know that Roy Cohn one day did go too far by threatening to expose someone who was a liberal lawyer as a homosexual. And of course, Cohn himself, there was plenty of evidence, and those papers were released. We know the full text of that moment where the lawyer says, have you no decency? Have you no sense of decency at all? And it means something quite different. He is telling Roy Cohn, I know you're gay. Don't go there. Yeah. So it will Laura Loomer at some point go someplace and the trapdoor opens and she's gone. If so, what would that be?
Right.
Okay, Neil. So let's go on to the things we want to go viral this week. And I'm going to take the unusual step of going first because your viral item is something we've both read, so we can talk about it a little bit. What I want to go viral this week is John Hersey's Hiroshima, which was published in 1946, a year after the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended the war with Japan. And this book actually did go viral about 80 years ago. It was commissioned by Harold Ross at the New Yorker. William Shawn was the editor who commissioned it. Harold Ross, the managing editor, had mixed feelings about doing it. But once he saw it, he said, we're devoting the entire August 31st issue to publishing this book in the New Yorker. And the New Yorker, I think, has only done that 3 times. Once with Hiroshima, once with Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, where obviously they didn't publish the whole book, but a big chunk of it. And then with a book on the massacre at El Mozote in El Salvador, which was a deep report into the Reagan administration's support of a genocidal regime. Why do I want this to go viral now? Well, first of all, it's interesting as the history of media. Not only did the New Yorker send it out to thousands and thousands of readers, the Book of the Month Club was so impressed by it that they just sent it out as a free pick. They didn't make anyone in the club pay for it. And then radio stations picked it up. ABC was one, BBC was another, and they did complete readings of the book on air, right? And so every technology to spread the news of this book was adopted. And it comes at a really important time, which is a massive concern about the proliferation of nuclear warfare, and particular concern in the United States about the amount of power the United States has in the world with this weapon. But the other reason I wanted to go viral is that most people in 1946 didn't actually know what had happened at Hiroshima. And it is a grim, vivid, deeply reported 31,000 words about something that has not happened since, which is an entire city being obliterated with a nuclear weapon and what happens to people. And I feel like we are in such a violent time now, Neil. What is happening in Gaza, what happened in Syria, what happened in Chechnya, that, war now is actually about doing what one bomb does over a period of 2 years or 3 years and killing the same number of people, decimating the landscape slowly. I think it's important for us to face it as a nation again. So I would urge listeners to go back to this book. There's a link in our show notes where you can go straight to the New Yorker and you can read the original publication of it if you don't want to buy the book. But I absolutely want this to go viral. I think as Americans, we have to think about war again.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. I've always wanted to. I've never have read it. I've always wanted to, and this seems like a perfect encouragement to do that as soon as
Yeah.
possible.
You won't be able to put it down, Neil.
Well, I want to talk about a book that I was not able to put down, although I'm still not totally sure how I feel about it. I gobbled this book up. It's a book that I think probably a lot of people have heard of recently. It came out early at the beginning of the summer, Murderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers by Caroline Fraser. Caroline Fraser is a well-regarded author, Pulitzer Prize winning author for biography that came out, I don't know, almost a decade ago about Laura Ingalls Wilder. In this book, she's sort of blending three different things together. But the one that's sort of obvious from the title is it's a history of serial killers who come out of the Pacific Northwest, which is also where she's from. So the second thing that's happening in this book is it's sort of her own memoir of growing up in Mercer Island in Seattle with a sort of overbearing and horrible Christian Scientist father. She's also written another book about the history of Christian Science. And then the third thread of this book, or the third sort of major theme of this book, is it's a history of environmental pollution in the Pacific Northwest, particularly of lead and arsenic and other industrial chemicals that were produced en masse in this region and that despoiled the land, the air, and the water of this area. And ultimately, her argument in this book is that the fact that so many serial killers came out of this region, and the fact that this region was a place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of great environmental poisoning, that these are connected aspects. These are connected factors. That in fact, the pollution led to these men becoming violent, horrific serial murderers. That is not a successful aspect of this book for me at all. The argument is suggested over and over again, or rather the connection is suggested over and over again, but I do not think it was convincingly made. And so that's a real problem of this book for me. And I think of many people who have reviewed it, and yet I couldn't put it down. I gobbled it. I really loved the way she threaded together her own history, her own biography, and her family history in this region and in this place where so many violent killers were also coming together. And I found that sort of interplay between memoir and history really just mesmerizing. I mean, really, it was a hard book to put down, even if it's also horrific. And you haven't read this yet, have you, Claire?
I did.
Oh, you did read it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll just send this to you with the question. What did you think about the tone of this book? I found it very odd to me. I think glib is the way I would describe the book. There's almost like a sarcastic aspect in a lot of the writing, a sarcastic tone that feels a bit strange to me when what you're writing over and over again is like one absolutely disgusting and brutal rape and murder scene after another. So that's a lot of different responses to this book. Claire, take it any direction you want to.
Well, it's interesting, Neil. I agree with you. There are sort of three books that are threaded together here. One is her memoir of growing up with this abusive father and her repeated desire to kill him.
Yeah.
So she is in this atmosphere in which there are serial killers all over the place. And she's kind of imagining, well, if I push my father off the boat and he would drown, then everybody would think it was natural and normal. Or if I hit him over the head, would they, so I found that rather grim. But I also found the litany of the murders as they accelerate difficult to read.
Same.
But it did occur to me that, the book I'm writing, which is the biography of Susan Brown Miller, the middle of the book is all about violence against women and the anti-pornography movement and so on. And I thought, well, actually the anti-pornography movement is happening at this exact same time. And the anti-rape movement is happening at this exact same time. But I have never seen anyone create a connection between the two of them. But it is also the case that the anti-pornography and anti-rape movements begin on the West Coast, in San Francisco, to be specific. So, and of course, Seattle is a big center of the women's movement. I did not think that I thought the connection between smelting and the poisoning of bodies and the fact that those bodies then go out of control. I thought it was an intriguing insight.
Yeah.
But I don't think she proved it.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's another theme, which you didn't mention, which is all of these bridges
Yes,
that connect
yes.
the different parts of the Seattle-Tacoma area that are so poorly built that they're constantly falling down. So there's the pontoon bridge that actually sinks. There's the Galloping Gertie that everybody knows sort of sways a lot in the wind. And then one day it just starts swaying so fast that it collapses. And I wasn't quite sure what that was doing there.
I had the same question about this obsession with the bridge. And one of them is like the site of like one horrific car crash after another.
Right.
And you could sort of understand how that might be a backdrop or a recurrent theme to like a book that was purely memoir, because she lives on the island that like all these things are connecting to. But like, is the point that this place was just so overwhelmed by violence? But then what's the point of that? Like, then it seems almost random, because I don't think she wasn't arguing that the bridge designers were under the influence of arsenic, or that like the people driving into the pilot, into the side of the bridge and dying were because they had like lost their mind on lead poisoning.
Right.
It's just a book that's sort of overwhelming in its story of violence. And it was hard to, even as I like literally couldn't put it down, it was also hard to go through.
Yeah, it was. And I think, the theme here for Fraser, certainly in relation to the last book, which was a biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder, is connecting human history to the history of the land and showing how humans do things to the land that then reverberates back on them and destroys them. But the kinds of destruction that she's talking about in this book are so much more complex and so intertwined. On a certain level, I wish she had pushed some of the other stuff aside and talked about the intense hatred of women that is being described in this book, because it's no accident. These men don't just kill anybody. They kill women, and they look for the kinds of women. I mean, it reminded me very much of the incel thing today. Women who are self-confident and pretty and hitchhiking and kind of hippie-ish, but also college students. They're not druggy, they're not out of it, and so on. They're very desirable. And the thing these men desire to do with them is kill them and then perform horrific acts on their dead bodies. I wish, in a sense, that she had focused more on that. But I do think the poisoning of bodies is intriguing. And of course, one of the things I thought about was the Trump administration decimating the EPA and getting rid of regulations. And it's perfectly clear that these are the same corporations that, 50, 60, 70 years ago said, doesn't matter, we're not doing anything wrong. If you're worried about the spume that's coming out of the pipe, we'll just build the pipe higher, and then it will go higher into the atmosphere, and then it'll be okay. So there was a kind of, premonition of, yes, we're about to start that cycle over again.
I thought so as well. Also, the extent to which these corporations were, actively burying information that they knew, right? The destroying research findings, reports, and all the rest, lawyering up every single time any sort of challenge or regulation was even suggested. And then a passage really struck me about how she talked about like growing up in Seattle and it being so gray all the time. And then all of a sudden, once some of these environmental regulations started put in place, all of a sudden there was blue skies over Seattle again. And thought, I remember growing up and hearing all the jokes about smog in LA in the early 80s. Like that was late night stand-up fodder for Jay Leno and whatever to talk about the smog. And then that disappeared. you know,
Right.
and we're sort of hurtling back to, I think, that environmental future again.
Yeah. And I think, one of the questions I had at the end of the book that she really doesn't answer is like, well, why do some people become serial killers and other people don't?
Exactly.
If everybody's being poisoned, but there
And
are
we're
only
talking
12
millions
serial
of people
killers.
in this region. Yeah.
Right.
And, you know,
Why
7
these
come out
people?
as serial killers. Yeah.
Right. And that was not answered. But, I would read a serial box that was written by Caroline Fraser. She's a beautiful writer. And I agree. I would recommend the book too. Even it raises more questions than it answers. That's not a terrible thing for a book to do.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, Neil, it's been fun to see you again, and we'll see you next week, right?
Yeah, great to see you, and we'll see what we're up for next week. And and crazy things are happening. Who knows? Right?
Who knows? Maybe we'll get Loomered, and we can talk about that. And that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or support our work for as little as $5 a month. Why Now is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers to Political Junkie. Why Now and Political Junkie are written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is by Alceiver Lake. You can find their work on Soundstripe. And you can subscribe to Why Now on your favorite podcast platform. Please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. That's all for now. See you next week.